Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program. We're joining you this evening from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Nan Wolverton, Interim Vice President for Programs at the Society. We have some newcomers this evening, so I'm just going to say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society, which is a national research library and archive in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed or produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include newspapers, books, manuscripts, children's literature, and graphic arts materials, including some that you will see in tonight's presentation. Our speaker drew on our collections here for her research. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the country and indeed from around the globe to use our reading room or to seek out digitized materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like today's virtual program, and I invite you to return to join us for upcoming program in the coming weeks and months. This evening's program is the first in a series we are calling Women Make History, focusing on women's history and authors. And we hope that you will return to see others in this series. You can go to our website for continual updates, including other series related to nature and the environment, artists in the archive, Indigenous insights, history of the book talks, and perspectives from the collections, programs that consider one object in our collections from multiple areas of expertise. We thank you for joining us this evening. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep this work going. And thank you. I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Amanda Condick, who will share with you a few of the logistics about the format for our program and how you can engage with our speaker for the question and answer portion of the program. Amanda.
Thank you, Nan, and welcome everyone. Closed captioning is available as an option for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relative links and information in the chat box. And if you'd like to save the chat to have the links for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me through the chat. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen and not the chat box. By using the Q&A function, we'll be able to keep track of your questions, and it also has an upvote option. So if someone posts a question you would like to see discussed, be sure to upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up icon. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program. And finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our website and our YouTube channel. So thank you, Nan. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Elizabeth Block is Senior Editor in the Publications and Editorial Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. At the Met, she edits exhibition catalogs, most recently Inspiring Walt Disney, the Animation of French Decorative Arts, and she's a managing editor of the academic journal Metropolitan Museum Journal. Elizabeth earned her PhD in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and she holds an MA in American Studies from Columbia University. Her articles have appeared in journals including In American Art, the 19th Century Art Worldwide, and in West 86, a journal of decorative arts, design history, and material culture. Her presentation tonight is based on her recent book, Dressing Up, The Women Who Influenced French Fashion, which was published by MIT Press in 2021. It was the winner of 3 publication grants, including the Aileen Roberto Grant from the Association of Dress Historians. Liz, welcome.
Thank you, Nan. So pleased to be here. Shall we go ahead and get started? Thank you, Nan. Again, it's such a pleasure to be presenting to the American Antiquarian Society, whose resources I have used nonstop during this project. And especially to be the first speaker in the Women Make History series. This is really just really an honor. So thank you. Thank you to everyone. It's always rewarding to show off a new book, and also to have the opportunity to show additional images and views of garments that were not able to fit into the book, the ones that got away, if you will. So I'll be showing several of those today. The topic of women buying French fashion in the 19th century is endlessly fascinating to me. What I try to do in dressing up is restore the sense of equilibrium between the creators of couture and the patrons of couture in the period, specifically by looking at the women who were spending money on the garments. Many of the names of the American women are familiar to us today, especially in New York and Massachusetts. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Schermerhorns, the Goulds, Glessners, McKays, Stanford, I could go on. Yes, these were wealthy women who were spending family money, but they were doing it with intention, and in many cases, a surprising amount of frugality and practicality. And just to set a little bit of a sense of context, a dress in the late 19th century could, at this level of couture from France, could cost $1,600 for a single dress. That would be the equivalent of almost $47,000 today. As with many inquiries, mine started with a John Singer Sargent painting that most of you will probably know, showing you Sargent's Madame X from 1883-84 in the Met's collection. And many people find it fascinating to hear how this whole inquiry began. So I'll give you a little story here. I was working on an article on women's fashion and hairstyles in portraiture, and I sent a draft of the paper to a friend from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where I had done my PhD. And he wrote back as usual with terrific feedback and queries. But when he got to the discussion about Madame X, he said, you know, you're writing about this narrow, thin, you know, slim, slender black dress that we all know, have seen before. But who do you think made it? And I think we need to know more about that person or that fashion house. And that really launched the inquiry. So the inquiry into the Maison Félix is really how this whole project started. We believe that the Maison Félix designed the slender black dress in Madame X, which is, the sitter's name is Madame Gautreau. She was a socialite from New Orleans, and she married well and spent time, most of her time in Paris as a so-called professional beauty. It's very, very difficult to document the makers of dresses and paintings, and we don't know for sure that Maison Félix made the black dress, but we do have, you know, one document, one slip of paper that says that Gautreau was a patron of the Maison Félix. She was probably also going to the House of Worth, the House of Doucet, all in the most fashionable area of Paris. But it brought me on this journey into looking into Félix. So I include an entire chapter in Dressing Up on the Maison and its founder, Emile Martin Poussinot, who was called Félix. And I began tracking all of the known garments by this house. And there are many in the US, many in Europe that we're lucky to have. The house was in business from the 1860s to 1901. And in my book, I look into the reasons why it may have fallen out of business so abruptly in 1901, which most likely had to do with overspending by the owner, Poussinot, at the Paris Exposition of 1900. But that's my supposition at the moment. More on Félix. This is a gorgeous opera gown in the collection of the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles. And it's just exquisite. It's probably the most exquisite existing garment by Félix. And I recently was talking with the curator there, Kevin Jones, and he said, Liz, you know, we also have the daughter's opera gown, the matching opera gown. And I said, wait, you have a child's opera outfit? And he said, well, she wasn't a child. The daughter of the woman who owned this opera gown was coming out into society. She would have been in her late teens and had a matching opera gown to her mother. So you can envision what a sight, what a beautiful sight it would be to have a mother-daughter in matching opera gowns by Felix enter an opera house. You can see here the model has the long opera gloves that would have been worn. You can see this is 1887 about, so the protruding bustle in the background that came in and out of fashion in the 1880s, and the lower bodice, which would have been appropriate for wearing to the opera, not as much during the day. It's made of cream colored silk and all the finery that an haute couture house would have provided. You can see the ribbons, the bows. Maison Felix was located at 15 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and it was spread out on several floors. These extraordinary documentary images come from a newspaper from Paris, 1894. The house renovated, it was about 4 stories. It renovated its salons in 1892, 93, and this was a celebration. This article spread was a celebration of the renovation. And you can see the interior was made to resemble a warm home setting, an upper class home setting, so that patrons, women coming in, would feel comfortable in the space. You can see the greenery of the plants. There's plenty of comfortable seating. There's beautiful carpeting, which keeps it warm, and many mirrors as well. We also know that the Maison had patrons who were actresses and opera singers. And so in this renovation, Poussinot commissioned Louise Abema, the female painter, to paint portraits of theater performers for some of the other rooms. And there is another photograph that shows that Sarah Bernhardt was a famous actress who was a patron of Felix, and she is in one of the paintings by Abema. You can also envision here, there were live models who would walk through the spaces modeling the Felix gowns. One of them included Poussinot's wife. We know the House of Worth, Charles Frederick Worth's wife, also was a live model in the space. So these were very much women's rooms. We may ask, where were the men? Where were the husbands? They may have been on a lower floor in a drawing room made to their taste for waiting, or most likely they were not there. They were most likely at home or work, and women were out shopping and getting fittings on their own or in pairs. The firm was a household name in the United States. It was spoken in the same breath as Worth, Paquin, Doucet, but it has fallen out of the historical record because we don't have business documentation or ledgers for it. I've been in touch with the family and they don't have business records, but we're trying to find as much as we can. One of the reasons why I've gone on for a couple of minutes about the Maison Felix, and I could go on for hours, let me tell you, is that it helps us restore some of these other couturier names to the fashion picture in Paris at the time. Many of the names have been lost to us, and many of them were women creators. To name just one other, Madame Rodriguez, we know, designed in Paris, and we have this beautiful, I have in the book, a beautiful blue and red dinner gown that's now in the Kyoto Costume Institute. And I was so grateful that they allowed me to reproduce it in the book. There are just so many other names and so many other designers that are yet to be researched that I've just begun to work on: La Ferrière, Lippmann, Pascode, and more. So let's set the scene a little further here in Paris by using a painting by Jean Béraud. He was known for painting Parisian city life, and really is so illustrative to this scene that we're setting. We see here a bustling shopping day on the Rue de la Paix. The house of Doucet was at number 21 on this famous street, and at the upper left, you can make out the OUCET of Doucet's shop. We see a shop girl in the middle of the canvas holding a dress box as her client enters her horse-drawn carriage that has come to pick her up from her shopping day. And we have another painting by Barreau, again, who comes really in handy for this topic. This one's in front of the Maison Paquin. And we see that this Maison was at number 3 on the same street. At the upper right, you can make out the PAQ of the Paquin sign. And these signs, these couture signs and other businesses in the fashion industry really dotted the city, the higher end of the city. And one historian, I like the way she puts it, is that these signs marked the urban landscape with the names of the makers. And many of the names are international. As I mentioned, Rodriguez, many more yet to be researched. We see a pair of women turned out in summer afternoon dresses and hats, perhaps discussing their shopping excursion. Another customer emerges from the store, glancing over at them as the doormen look on. Meanwhile, in the center, we see another shopper coming out. She's coming out of her carriage and ready to enter the Maison Paquin. More about the diversity within the fashion industry. When we talk about the fashion industry, we're not just talking about designers or couturiers of the gowns and the dresses and the garments, but we're also talking about all these other aspects of the industry, which includes coiffeurs, hairdressers, perfumers, makers of lingerie, accessory makers. Everyone had a parasol, the milliners who made the bonnets and the hats, the trunk suppliers for people who were buying abroad, for the women we're talking about who are buying abroad and bringing home the clothes in trunks on the steamships. Also shippers for these transnational customers who needed some of their gowns to be shipped to them later when they got home. And also cleaners. We have invoices from cleaners of clothing. I mean, some of the streets these horses could kick up quite an amount of dust. So people were spending a significant amount on cleaning. And all these specialties relied on one another to make the fashion industry a success. For the moment, I'll focus briefly on the hairdressers and perfumers. Sometimes they were the same person or the same firm. For example, Lenterique. We're looking at an image of Lenterique's hair salon. This is from a newspaper, 1893. We see coiffures, so these male hairdressers working on female clients in this space, another fascinating point of gender sharing space, different genders sharing the same space. And they're shampooing in the American style here. And what that meant is that they were shampooing with water. Shampooing the hair was not practiced frequently. It was not thought to be sanitary to do so. A woman might clean her hair with shampoo only once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, or even as little as once a month. It was thought to be more hygienic to comb the hair frequently to release dust and dirt. But when one did shampoo, there was the option of a wet shampoo or a dry shampoo. And so here from this French newspaper, they're showing that Lenterique offered the American style, which was to use water. And because American buildings in the United States were frequently newer than buildings in Europe, they had plumbing for water and could use running water at salons or in the home. And so here we see shampooing with water. And you'll notice the sort of mechanism, the instrument in the middle, toward the middle right of the image. That's a hair dryer. It's one of the earliest mechanical hair dryers that I've seen in print. And you'll notice also that it's on wheels. So it could be wheeled from station to station to dry the hair. Lenterique also sold silk flowers and it sold perfume. And this is an image of the florist workroom where women are fashioning and arranging the silk flowers. So note that women are in the workforce here. Middle-class French women are working here. And you'll see in the background on the shelving, the perfume. There's another image in the same newspaper, which I didn't bring today, showing men in the basement making the perfumes in vats. It looks like they're sort of stirring beer. But this I thought was a prettier image for the moment. Perfume came into the fashion world. It was, just as important as hairdressing and all these other aspects that we've been talking about. But what I discovered was that women would like to have their signature scent in their dresses. So these perfumers would make 2 by 2 inch silk sachets with violet leaves or rose leaves within the sachet, and would sew them into the waistband of the gowns. And so the gowns would be scented. I wanted to say, because a lot of the audience members I know are researchers, how I came to think about the hairdressers and the perfumers in relation to the dress designers. I had the pleasure of flipping through periodicals, French fashion periodicals in Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum where I work. And I kept noticing that at the bottom, in the credits, if you will, in these fashion plates, that the designers were credited. Here's one from 1858, and we know that the dresses were made by Gaglen. The coiffures were by Madame Comproget, who I haven't researched yet. So with equal billing is the main point here. Here's another fashion plate. This one's later. It's 1878. The dress is by Lefebvre, and the perfume is by Legrand. Legrand seems to be a popular perfumier who was credited in many of the periodicals. The magazine editors seem to like that house. But what was so striking to me is that, yes, it made visual sense to credit the designer and visual sense to credit the coiffure, although it wasn't, thinking about hairstyles is something that a lot of us are coming to now. But the fact that the perfumiers were credited, that perfumes were recommended to go with certain dresses, was new to me. And it spoke to me as to how important the interrelationship between these different makers and suppliers were in the fashion industry. So now that we have a sense of the fashion industry in Paris, let's talk about the French styles and how the French styles disseminated in the United States. So I'm showing opening day at Lord & Taylor's store. This is an image from Frank Leslie's from 1873. Lord & Taylor had its new location, and this is an image from the elevator. Many of us are familiar with the literature on department stores and many of the names. Department stores were the hallmarks of democratic marketplaces in the period. We know Lord & Taylor, B. Altman, A.T. Stewart, Bloomingdale's, for the Massachusetts crowd, Jordan Marsh. They sold American goods, but also a large array of French fabrics, trimmings, and finished high-end garments. Many were imported directly from Paris. And the buyers from the department stores went to Paris to see the designs and to place orders to bring back for their own store. So we can see the relationship between French couture and American department stores was symbiotic. And as you would guess, it did not take long for knockoff goods to come into the marketplace, a topic that I cover in my chapter in Dressing Up called The Underworld and Afterlife of French Couture in the United States. Another way that styles disseminated was through pattern books and periodicals. Here is a colored lithograph in the Society's collection. It was put out by Butterick, showing the summer fashions for 1875. It is economically designed to show as many styles as possible and for a range of ages, including quite small children. One of the most influential women's magazines was Goadie's Ladies' Book, which many of you are familiar with. It began in 1830 with the title The Lady's Book and was published in Philadelphia. It relayed fashions from both London and Paris and carried accounts of royal events and masked balls. In 1852, it started to take mail orders from readers for patterns, and in 1853, it commenced printing patterns on its pages. In the 50s through 70s, the reporting of French fashion increased, as did the magazine's readership, reaching an impressive 150,000 in the early 1860s. Many of the hand-colored fashion plates, in fact, were taken directly from French periodicals. Frank Leslie's magazine and Peterson's magazine provided similar coverage, with the former putting out several volumes of Frank Leslie's Ladies' Gazette of Paris, London, and New York fashions in the middle of the century. And this is an indication of when the, quote, big three cities had become ensconced in the US fashion consciousness. So women could gather ideas from magazines and then buy materials to sew their own versions of the garments at home or bring them to their local dressmaker to do so. Here we have a trade card for a local purveyor of dress goods in Jamestown, New York, also in the Society's collection. And here at left, a calling card for a dressmaker in New Orleans, and on the right, a trade card for a product that protected skirt bindings. And I like to show the image at the right because it gives a sense of how many dressmaking establishments were owned by women. Well, not only run by women and filled with women, but owned by women. And I just love a fitting room scene. This is social space. This is women's space. It's warm. There's, there's conversation going on, but then there's also the work of making a garment. Now, I couldn't resist bringing this. This is this wonderful paper doll bridal party in the Society's collection from about 1876. I'm just showing a few here, but I think in the chat we'll have a link so that you can see more of the cards that went with it. It's such a great set showing what the bridesmaids would have worn, and with interchangeable bonnets, which is something that's really fun. I talk about weddings quite a bit in Dressing Up because they're the most frequently documented events. And we have many more wedding garments than any other type of garment because they were handed down through generations. Another main category for fashion was fancy balls. And we simply must talk about the Great Vanderbilt Ball of 1883. How could we not? In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt and her husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt, held a housewarming for their new mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street in New York. It was on a Monday, and Alva Vanderbilt called for a fancy dress. She invited, we think, 1,000 people, and 600 attended. She did not say what type of fancy dress that people should wear, so there was just an enormous variety. They are rumored to have spent $250,000 on the party in total, which would be the equivalent of $6.8 million today. At left, we have the famous electric light dress that was worn by Alice Claypool Gwynn Vanderbilt, sister-in-law of William Kissam Vanderbilt, the host of the party. Worth made it for her and included the prop of a battery torch that you can see in the photograph by Maura at the right. And I had the pleasure, the true honor really, of seeing the electric light dress in person at the museum at FIT in 2019. It's rather petite. It's slightly less yellow than it looks in the image at the left. But what I was struck by was how the metallic thread and the tinsel on the sleeve catches the light so beautifully. And it was in plexiglass, and rightfully so, but I could only imagine how it would have sparkled and, and especially with the battery-powered torch. This was the height of the moment. This was especially on theme, and it was a huge hit. We're just extraordinarily lucky that it survives and is kept so well in the Museum of the City of New York. Here's a photograph in the New York Historical Society of Alice Vanderbilt and her husband Cornelius Vanderbilt II. She's in her dress, and he was dressed as an 18th century duke, and you can see that he's wearing a powdered wig. For fancy balls, people got their costume ideas from books like R. Dern Holt's Fancy Dresses Described. It was published in several editions starting around 1879. And I'm showing you a page at the left from the edition of 1880. The guidebook is extraordinary. It's really a glimpse into the zeitgeist of the period, with themes ranging from electric light to newspapers, photography, postage, telegrams, chocolatiers, to name just a few. But the Hornet was especially popular, as you can see. Constance Reeves Borland wore the Hornet outfit to the Vanderbilt ball. We have this wonderful image from Mora. He was a photographer. He was a well-known photographer, and he was hired to take party shots, party images against backdrops at the actual ball, and then some would have been taken the next day as well. I put up this comparison so you can see how Borland had her dressmaker copy the image from Holt's guidebook pretty closely, but you can see that she altered the top. So rather than the almost turtleneck, if you will, on the left, Borland had her dressmaker go for sleeveless, and then she went with the long gloves. And make sure to see that your eye catches the wings at the back of her outfit. Finally, I have a chapter in Dressing Up about recycling and repurposing of clothes in the period, which speaks to the larger theme about how American women came to the couture marketplace with a deep knowledge of fabrics, sewing, and caring for garments. Here we see a two-piece dress made by the French designer Melanie Pascoe about 1878, when it was purchased by Francis Drexel Paul of Pennsylvania. In the portrait of Paul by Charles E. Drake, she wears an alternate bodice that she had made by a Philadelphia dressmaker. People would stretch their purchases, if you will. Some bought extra fabric in France and then had an additional piece made at home, or pieces. Women rewore outfits over the course of years. When they were finished with them, they might sell them to a secondhand purveyor or donate them to middle-class women or their maids. This led to a trickle-down effect of disseminating styles over the course of years. As you will recall, Frances Folsom of Buffalo, New York, married sitting President Grover Cleveland on June 2nd, 1886, when she was 21 years old. For the wedding, she wore a gown believed to be by the House of Worth. She quickly became a style icon, with women across the country copying her garments and her signature hairstyle with the curled bangs at front, which we can see here in this card, this photographic card by J.E. Hale that's in the Society's collection. We get a further sense of Frances Cleveland's style when we look at this ensemble of a dress with multiple bodices in the National Museum of American History. During my research, I learned that the original floral sheen skirt and bodice, as well as the peach velvet bodice, were probably made around 1895 by the House of Doucet in Paris. You'll recall the Béraud painting we looked at earlier, where we saw the Doucet sign and shop. The green velvet bodice was created later by Baltimore dressmaker Lottie M. Barton. The combination of work by a French couturier supplemented by a bodice commissioned from an American dressmaker underscores one of the main themes of dressing up. There was a rootedness in familiar local practices and it produced an entrenched frugality that was not relinquished quickly, even for first ladies. Some wealthy American women would bargain down prices quoted by French designers, and many did what Frances Cleveland did, bring extra French fabric to a local dressmaker to produce supplementary pieces, or ask them to rework fabric already in the ensemble. Lastly, I just had to show these photographs in the Society's collection. They were taken by Theodore Clemens Walbrook of Worcester, Massachusetts, of his wife Mabel in 1905 to 1910, a little bit later than our main period. They're remarkably candid family photographs by this professional photographer. And in these three in particular, we see how Mabel Walbrook used a favorite fur muff as a prop. And because museum matchups are so fun, I paired them here, the photographs here, with two American-made fur muffs in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. They date to the last quarter of the 19th century, so indeed Walbrook may have purchased hers several years before these photos were taken, and it was clearly a favorite accessory. To conclude, women were exerting their influence on one of the key industries in France's economy, which was couture. They were impacting the economics of this era on their own terms. They relied on their own expertise of fashionable trends and on their own knowledge, deep knowledge of fabrics. And indeed, they could make or break reputations. These women had a significant impact on a major industry, both as consumers and as influencers. Thank you. I have my contact information here in case anyone would like to stay in touch and share research and share research queries. And I think we're going to go to the Q&A now, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's a wonderfully visual and informative talk. We have a lot of really great questions coming in the Q&A. I wanted to just start though and get ahead of that, just so that I can ask my own question, one that I'm really interested in. I find it's really hard to look at these gorgeous dresses without thinking about the amount of labor that went into producing them. And I recall an image in your book that showed seamstresses working in a room. I think I counted 10 to 12 of them, women working, sewing away, one woman sitting on the floor. I just wondered if it would be great to hear a bit more about that whole industry, the production of these dresses, but also you touched on this. I'd love to hear you talk more about the interconnection of the garment makers with the hairdressers and the perfumers, and just that whole world and how the interdependence there, and maybe even the power struggles that went on. So I'm just really interested in the labor force.
Oh, for sure. And there were tensions. So one of the images that I like that I read about, and that I have a very vivid image in my mind of, is how there was tension between the milliners, the hat makers, the bonnet makers, and the hairdressers, so the coiffeurs. The tension was because if that particular year the milliners decided we're going for a big hat style, then the coiffeurs were forced to do a lower hairstyle. Or in turn, if the hairdressers wanted to do a larger style, then the milliners were forced to do just smaller, more conservative hat and bonnet styles. So and charge lower prices for them because there was less fabric and less labor going into them. So there was this tension. And what's so fascinating to me about a figure like Lenterique, and we're never just talking about one person. You know, we say Lenterique, but we're talking about the Maison Lenterique, not just Charles Guillaume, because they employed hundreds of people. But where Lenterique's business was so clever is that, as you could see, Lenterique did not design clothing, but sort of cornered the market with doing hair, perfume, silk flowers, and other nouveautés, so other accessories that they were selling. It's really very clever, and you can start to get a sense of, where businesses knew to step back, where they were not in the forefront, and where they could move into the forefront. And some of them were so successful that they were branching out into other cities. And Lanvin, for example, branches out to Argentina, Buenos Aires. Several of them have branches in London, also New York, Saratoga Springs.
Great. And were the seamstresses, was there an apprentice system whereby young women would start out and sort of move up?
Yeah, an apprentice system. And then the goal would be to move into being sort of, what we would call now an assistant designer, or like a madam of the house, meaning that you would be the go-to person for some of these high-end clients. We have letters from American women stating who their favorite salespeople were at Worth, and recommending to their friends, look for, Madam so-and-so, she knows the best, what to give you. So there's so many individuals that we have yet to learn about.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's really fascinating. We have a question here from Jean Trotnier, who is wondering, several people are wondering, how were the gowns cleaned? You touched briefly, you talked a little bit about that, but also noting that not too often if the sachets kept their fragrance. So do you know much about the cleaning of these? It has been very complicated.
That's such a great question. That's another area of research that I will be getting into. It wasn't chemical cleaning. So I know more about, so for soaps and dry shampoo for the body, they were, mixes of ground flowers and natural items like that. For cleaning the actual clothes, it's an excellent question. I can't imagine that they were dousing anything in water. It must have been a dry system, but there's more to it. And the person who asked the question makes an excellent point about perfume. There was a lot of perfume covering, natural odors, and the dresses that we still have today, they have signs of wear, and there's bodily oils that show up on the garments that conservators try to remove today.
Right, yeah. Bonnie Fitzgerald is asking if you know what kinds of scents were popular in perfumes at this time. For example, floral, spicy, warm, and she's loving the presentation.
Thank you for coming. What I read about most are florals, so violets, rose, orchid scents, and they were individualized. So the newspapers would report on what the upper class women in the United States were wearing. It's remarkable how widespread it is. The Associated Press would pick up stories, and so if up for a party in New York, would get picked up in a paper in Nevada, and you can read exactly what Astor Vanderbilt were wearing. But not only just the dresses, the jewelry, but the perfume. So the general public, the general readership of newspapers would know that Caroline Astor preferred a violet scent, and she was known for it. It's very specific.
No, that's great. This is a really good question about process from Angela Ray. She just presents a scene here. An American actress goes to Paris around 1880 to purchase a dress from the House of Worth. What would that experience have been like? Would she place an order beforehand? Would she solicit advice from the courtier? Would she wait in France for the gown to be produced, or would the gown be shipped?
Terrific question, and all of the above. So one of the hallmarks of the couture in this period is that the major houses would keep measurements on file for their best patrons. So for Sarah Bernhardt, very famously narrow as a sparrow is the quote that we see most often about her. Her measurements would have been kept at Worth and at Felix. So if there was a new design that year that the house thought she may be interested in, they could work up a model based on her measurements. And the same would go for, Mrs. McKay from Chicago. They would keep measurements on file. And keep in mind, many of these women were having children every few years. Their measurements would change, and they would make sure that their couture houses would know how they had changed. As far as, picking up or shipping, it varied. I mean, the dresses could take, they could take weeks to make. They were not made overnight, except in a couple of high-end examples that I can think of. And so if you were Caroline Astor and you were renting a home in Paris every year for 3 or 4 months, you'd have your dresses made, and then you could take them with you in your trunks and bring them home with you. If you were an actress who was going over for a shorter period of time, they may have been shipped in a trunk over on a steamship, and you would receive them later. And that's where we have these stories of the wonderful unpacking experience of unpacking your dress box. And again, those sachets, so the perfume would exit the box right as you were opening it.
Wow. Kate Pitt is asking, to what extent were dresses, either for costume parties or daily wear, influenced by what theater actresses were wearing on stage in plays?
Yes, I have a chapter on mid-century influencers, and actresses were very much influencing styles. In this period, the actresses, there's not as much of a stigma on actresses for being, of low moral fabric, if you will. They are looked at as style icons, to use a term from today. They were wearing costumes and daily wear from these high-end makers. There was not a stigma like we have in some cases today, where costume for theater was considered a separate entity from haute couture. It wasn't like that. So we know that actresses were getting the best of the best, and that, there were so many images of actresses in cabinet cards and trade cards that circulated in multiples, so people could copy what they were wearing.
What would happen, someone asked, if two ladies showed up in the same costumes?
So much was custom made that it's rare to see that. I think that would, I think I can only think of one example, and it's a photograph from 2 women at the Paris exposition of 1900 with black and white striped dress, but it's a black and white photograph, so we don't know that they were exactly the same. But because everything was so custom at that level, we don't see the exact same dress coming out. Costumes a little different, because for a fancy ball, because they were using these handbooks. So if you'll recall that Hornet outfit that I showed, we have photographs by Mora of 2 different women wearing the same Hornet outfit, just slightly different at the top by their own dressmakers.
So it could happen. Caroline Riley is asking, thank you for the talk. She appreciates your layered approach to your research. You provided an overview of how women could have learned about French fashions. I wondered if you knew when the New York Times first started publishing fashion images.
I'll have to look back exactly at the year for the New York Times, but the newspapers in this period, they start off by describing. So it's all words describing dresses and jewelry. And then as print mediums pick up, later in the century, we start to see line drawings, and those become really valuable. You can see line drawings of these designers' dresses and worn by American women. So they would go to a party, and then the party report, the gossip columns, if you will, would show these drawings of the actual dresses they were wearing. And then at the very end, like toward the turn of the century, we get photographs, and those are, those are invaluable.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of sort of detail costume-specific questions, like were the bodices attached to the skirts? If so, how? And are the muffs ermine?
So let me take the question first. The fur muffs are there's very many different types of fur that were being used in the period. Ermine was popular and costly and and luxurious. One of the women I show in the book is Edith Kingdon Gould, and she has this beautiful red velvet gown that made for her by Charles Frederick Worth, and then she has this beautiful brown fur stole that she wears with it that is descended into her family today. So it's still existing, which is so terrific. But ermine, then you have you even see monkey fur, you see lots of bird feathers too, and small mammals. I mean, small mammal were very popular. So you'll see muffs with small heads on them, and you'll see also stoles. So they can be difficult to look at today, but it wasn't an animal rights moment. But so right, the ermine for the high end furs, you wouldn't be seeing like rabbit fur for these women. And then for the bodices were interchangeable. I would have to ask a technician exactly how they were attached, but they were clearly meant to be swapped out.
Great. I wanted to ask you if you could just talk a little bit about your research process for this book. I know you used a fair amount of materials in our collections, but you looked at a lot of collections, both costume collections, archives. Could you talk a little bit about the process in putting together this very extensively researched process?
Thank you for the question. It's a combination of many different sources and museums and institutional libraries, really, because the book is, it's a material culture approach and a visual culture approach to social history. And so I needed to look at text documentation as well as visual documentation as well as existing objects. And I'm so grateful to the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We have such a strong collection of 19th century fashion, garments, accessories, and I had the great honor of looking at some of these garments in the Research Studies Center. There's nothing like it, really, getting that up close to a Félix dress and to see the label in the waist, to see the beautiful black velvet of a certain dress, to see the stays inside the corset that would have given the hourglass shape. So it's a combination of looking at actual garments, going to fashion exhibitions to look at garments that otherwise wouldn't be on view, and then newspapers and periodicals are a gold mine, and we're so lucky today that so many are digitized, especially American Antiquarian Society. I could not have done it without your collection of trade cards, even the paper dolls, and they show you undergarments that you would not have been reproduced in mass periodicals. So really taking a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, great. That's so interesting. We have a question here from Carla Peterson. Was there an ideal, you were talking about Sarah Bernhardt and her very slender body type. Was there an ideal female body type? Mrs. Astor is not slim, she notes. I'm wondering, were there certain body types that were associated with houses of couture, that one or another, or is it just could they handle the range of what was out there? Certainly there were a lot of heavier set women.
That was one of my angles into the Maison Félix, and the topic of my article in West 86 is that I started to see that Félix was distinguishing its house from its competitors by going for the slender, less embellished look than, say, Worth was. And I think that's one of the reasons why Bernhard would have been attracted to that house in particular. But you think about how crowded the marketplace was. There were so many high-end couturiers. And so I think Felix separated out by going for that slender look. Hourglass was the way to go. Ideally, the corset brought the waist in, brought the bust out. 1880s especially, you had the protruding bust sole. And the ideal beauty, of course, today it's very different, but the idea, in these etiquette books and these guidebooks on how to be a 19th century woman, they would talk about the, ivory colored skin and the, no blemishes and not overwashing the hair, all of these beauty tips that went along with the clothing. But it's true that Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt were not slim in the images that we have them when they were matrons. Remember, they had kids. Caroline Astor had four kids, and her measurements would have changed. Most of the images we see of her, there aren't very many images of her. Most of the ones that we see are later in life, and she would have had her dresses custom made, measurements on file.
This is a great question from Catherine Walsh. She wonders if you could describe some insights that you gleaned from close looking at a particular piece of historical fashion that you would not have known from looking at fashion drawings of it.
Yes. So looking at Felix in the research room, the storage room at the Metropolitan Costume Institute, signs of wear. You don't think about that when you look at fashion plates, because fashion plates are of course showing the ideal brand new gown or ensemble, but seeing signs of wear and alteration. So seeing how a waistline was taken in or let out, or a piece of fabric was swapped in where a place had been, some of the silk had been worn. That really gives you the sense of bodies in these garments, and that brings the whole story to life.
Great. We have some questions that I think went into the chat, and we'll look at first, I'll note that our curator of children's literature, Laura Wazowitz, was glad that you used the paper doll set. She buys paper dolls, particularly for the underwear. So keeping you researchers in mind.
Yes. Oh, that's terrific. I mean, they're invaluable. They really are. You never get such a candid look like that. They're just terrific. And to see that much skin, it's really helpful for researchers.
And here's another one. We're getting close to time, but I want to get as many in as possible. You mentioned that a fashion house may go out of business for overextending, perhaps at the World's Fair, as an example that you had given. But what specifically stretched their limits where business is concerned in the fashion industry?
Great question. I think what would have stretched them was spurred because this was there were so many economic decisions that went into staying in business. So I often think about the Maison Felix's renovation in 1892-93. What did it look like before? We don't know, but you could see how lush, how lavish that space was that, posturing. And then 1897, they put out a fashion gazette that cost money. And then the overextension of these elaborate exhibitions at the Exposition of 1900. In a way, it boils down in that case to advertising and to posturing in the market because there was so much competition. So some would make it, some wouldn't.
Yeah. Linda Fort is asking, were knockoffs a thing? We didn't really get a chance to go into the whole underworld of fake labels. And
yes, there's a chapter in the book here on knockoffs. They're so fascinating. So in order to keep this, again, this equilibrium of the marketplace with the makers and the consumers, and then these the trickle down effect where middle-class consumers were going to the department stores, eventually we get knockoff French fashion. So Worth and Félix, Worth was the first house to put labels in the pedesham of the waistband of their garments. They branded. I mean, they branded the clothing, and there would be a serial number on them, handwritten. And then Félix does it, and the others, Doucet, Pekin, La Ferre, and on. These would trickle down into knockoffs, and it's so rare to be able to identify an exact knockoff, but there's some wonderful curators who have done it. Kevin Jones at the Fashion Institute Design and Merchandising Museum in LA has a great eye for it. But yes, we have a couple of knockoffs. I do reproduce one in the book. It's a black dress that is a knockoff Worth, and there's just, you can tell. I mean, it's not as intricate. It's diluted, if you will, in a way. But yet someone, a buyer could say they were wearing a Worth. It has a label. There were fake labels that circulated.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. I have one quick last question that I think you can answer very, very quickly, and then we'll wrap up here. Nancy Eisenberg is asking, what's the best book or article on that 1883 party that you referenced, the Vanderbilt ball?
Well, I do have a chapter in dressing up on the 1883 ball, and I can say very confidently that all the latest research on that ball is in my book. I went very deep into the archives. It's such an exquisite event. The caterers, the florists, it's more than just fashion that I get into in that chapter. So I hope you will read it there.
Yeah, and I would say the architecture too, the spaces within which these events happen. It's pretty interesting to see how that all is part of the scene.
That's right.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Liz. This has been really a lot of fun. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I want to remind you that we have many other programs coming up this spring. Next week at this same time, we'll have a wonderful program called New Readings in 19th Century American Natural History with Juliana Chow and Jillian Osborne. The week following, we have a great program by Brian Ogren, which will be working with some of our collections related to the colonial Kabula of the Jews in our collections here at the Society. And then we have a great book talk that same week, which is called Useful Objects by Reed Gochbog, Museums, Science, and Literature in 19th Century America. So a lot of great things. The best thing to do is to go to our website and see the listings and register there. Thank you again, Liz, for a great program, and thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.